Good evening. Good evening. Good evening and welcome. Thank you. Good evening and welcome. I am Bimal Mendes. I'm an assistant dean at the Yale School of Architecture, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Shayari de Silva, whose talk this evening marks the official opening of the exhibition, Geoffrey Bawa, It is Essential to Be There. Shayari is both a graduate of Yale College with a major in architecture, as well as a graduate of the Yale School of Architecture, earning her master's degree in 2016. She's currently the Chief Curator at the Geoffrey Bawa Trust in Colombo, in Sri Lanka. The exhibition on the second floor gallery is made possible by the Bawa Trust and the Yale School of Architecture's Exhibition Fund and Program. This show is curated by Shayari de Silva and designed by Thilani Pereira, with the exhibition team at the Bawa Trust, working in concert with Isa Speri, their public engagement coordinator, all three of whom are here today with us. On the ground here at Yale, the exhibition team includes Andrew Benner, our Director of Exhibitions, Alison Walsh, the exhibition coordinator, with fabrication by True Line Productions and members of the exhibition gallery team. The logistics of bringing a show with original materials across an ocean offers unforeseen complexity, and the beautiful display is a culmination of incredible efforts and collaboration over many, many months. The first drawing you encounter in the exhibition is a map. It is a drawing you may easily miss on your way to see the exhibit itself. It is a map of Sri Lanka, and uniquely so because it depicts a globe centered on the island, with all the continents swirling around it like an archipelago adrift on a vast ocean. The island as a phenomenon looms large on Sri Lanka's psyche. Lanka, after all, means an island. And it is the context of the ocean and what is beyond its horizons that has influenced and reshaped the contours of Sri Lanka's shorelines and its identity over centuries. When you consider this drawing, you may see different things. It locates the island within the globe, certainly, and implausibly bending lines of latitude and longitude, perhaps to draw you in. And this centering may appear either strategic or precarious, depending on one's perspective. It is certainly that aspiration of a journey to a center, a place perhaps worth navigating to, that brought traders across oceans in antiquity, and later, and inevitably, wave after wave of colonial conquests, including the Portuguese in 1505, the Dutch in 1638, and the British in 1815, before Sri Lanka finally gained independence in 1948. But I also see this map as a drawing that looks outward, a view perhaps from the island itself, as if you were standing upon it, in the middle of the ocean, gazing out, as one normally does on an island, where the horizon extends and encircles your panoramic view. And Bawa's work, I think, gives shape to Sri Lanka's place in the world and offers a window into its identity as it continually navigates between being local and global, as this map does, as a way of both looking within and centering itself, but also looking outwards, acknowledging its connections and influences from far beyond. In many ways, drawing for Bawa becomes a medium by which this identity is explored and given shape to. Lines you'll see move seamlessly between inside and out. They gather vistas and contour the land, allowing buildings and nature to disappear into each other. In a way, Shayari too has navigated this map, moving through it to attend Yale, not once but twice, and through it considering what a Sri Lankan architecture might be from the perspective of being within Sri Lanka, and also reconsidering it from beyond. At Yale, Shayari did many things. She co-edited Perspecta 51, called Medium, together with Samantha Jaff, who is here. And she was immersed both in the studio, but also in the world of art, particularly in the art gallery and the Yale Center for British Art, where she was a scholar in building conservation. Her senior thesis in particular resonates today, which explored Sri Lanka's global entanglements, but from a contemporary perspective, bringing critical insight to the island's construction of new port towns by the Chinese government and indulgent infrastructures for entertainment and tourism, Memorably, Shayari moved beyond the conventions of what might be called traditional or modern, or even the sometimes tired tropes of tropical architecture and critical regionalism. Rather, she exhaustively searched for new and subtle terms that could address the nuance and complexity of what she saw and experienced firsthand in Sri Lanka. And what was clear from her research and fieldwork, even back then, was that what constitutes a Sri Lankan architecture remains a delightfully open question, as it continues to navigate between being local and global and many other things. And her formative research here, perhaps was a stage for her own immersion and critical appraisal of Geoffrey Bawa's iconic and important legacy. So please join me in welcoming Shayari de Silva back to Yale.
Thank you so much, Bimal. I'm so honored to be on this side of this podium this evening. And standing here, I feel I owe so much to this community. Its incredible teachers, Alec, Bimal, Joyce, Keller, Tratty, Frank, Sunil, so many more. My friends and family, some of whom are incredibly here. And I must also thank, both personally and on behalf of the Geoffrey Bawa Trust, Andrew and Alison, their crew, as well as Richard and AJ and the Dean, for this incredible opportunity to share Bawa's work with this audience. And it has been such a pleasure for us, for my team, to work with you. So Geoffrey Bawa. Geoffrey Bawa's work is sensuous. It is cinematic and deeply, deeply rooted in its location. The drawings that come out of this practice are often done after the fact. They translate an idea into an image, and infrequently they are tools for instruction. And the archives that exist today kind of exist by accident. Bawa was very suspicious of the archival afterlife of his work, and when he moved offices in the mid-80s, he created a bonfire in which an estimated third of the material was lost. And this exhibition that's upstairs came out of an attempt to study this material. It actually started off with the very kind of banal tasks of cataloging and digitizing material. And we were very keen that we did this in a way that involved our public in Sri Lanka, for whom an architectural archive was kind of a novel thing. And in doing so, we also realized that our very definition of what constitutes archives needed to be re-examined. And so today's talk, I'll first run you through some of the projects that are upstairs, and then talk about the ways in which we are trying to expand this understanding. In the process of working with this material, we did two things. We looked really closely at every sentence that Geoffrey had written, which was easy to do because he wrote so little. And we also did a series of oral histories, speaking to friends and collaborators. And this quote, where he says that the site gives the most important push to a design along with a brief, and without seeing the site, he cannot work. And this was something that many of his colleagues corroborated, that he would often only accept a project after he spent several hours on the site. And of course, it brings into question what then is the role of the drawing. And I think this tension that we see is partly because during Bawa's career, particularly the early part of his career, the builders in Sri Lanka, while incredibly skilled, were not necessarily reading drawings. That was not how they were used to taking instruction. And so many of much of the work I'm going to show you was actually done for exhibiting, several decades after the projects were done. Geoffrey's own drawings tend to look like this: small sketches packed with information. And they were frequently the key step to him being on site and then the project getting built. And everything else that I'm going to show you is done by other people. And while he would like us to understand his work by experiencing it in person, I do think that we can unpack this approach to placemaking, his idea of there, when he says it is essential to be there, through these archives. So, as I said, I'm going to look at a few of the projects presented upstairs, starting with this idea of situating a practice, understanding the terrain. Here you see the section of the Ena de Silva House, completed in 1962, for a client who would go on to be a dear friend and longtime collaborator of Bawa. The drawing is by Lakis Ranayake, who starts off as a draftsman in the office, but becomes a prolific multidisciplinary artist in his own right. And it is actually with this drawing that the practice begins to modify the kind of abstracted, codified Western architectural drawing style, to meld abstraction with granular specificity, especially regarding materials and plants, and emphasizing the way that the organic and the man-made, interior and exterior, merge in these spaces. And you see here the frangipani and mango trees that command the courtyard, as well as Ina's pet tortoise and the fish in the pond, which were all an important experience of the house. And this central courtyard is really important to the house because it's built at a time when Colombo is rapidly densifying and plot sizes are shrinking. And Bawa is unable to approach the site as was traditional, which would be to plop the house in the middle of the plot. So what he does instead is to move the rooms to the perimeter of the plot, and he uses this central courtyard to anchor the spaces, making them feel generous and expansive. Courtyards are a prevalent trope in traditional dwellings in Sri Lanka, and Bawa draws on the vernacular and the past very much the way modernists across the globe were doing, looking back to look ahead like Janus. The traditional courtyard is usually sunken at a slightly lower level, and it is an enclave, a space where you might dry your spices, rear chickens, perhaps have your household deities, and work that was often given to the women of the house. And Ena is a dynamic force, and she actually uses this courtyard as a stage. It's not a shelter, it's a stage for her. And it is where she begins her avant-garde batik textile practice, which we'll look at more of later. But this house then, when Ena moves away, she also rents it to another artist, and it becomes this really creative kind of fulcrum throughout its various occupancies. And we now look at a different type of domestic space, a bungalow in a coconut estate which was built between 1963 and 67. Based on accounts by both Bawa and his partner on this project, Ulrich Plesner, this house was designed in situ, using sticks and strings to incorporate the existing boulders into the structure, as you see here. Now, the colonial estate bungalow was one which would rather violently create a tabula rasa site, and then erect a building which kept the outside out and the inside in. So this approach, where the structure is completely open and it really works with what is already on the site, is quite radical, and we might even call it decolonial. And of course, as a result, Ulrich's memoirs have these amazing stories of elephants peeping over walls and vipers in the toilet. But it is an integrated relationship with the land, and I would also say an indigenous one. The plan, which we know for sure was done well after the building, is also the only drawing that exists for this project. So now in this next section, let's look at how building contextually is a question of how as much as it is a question of what. I also haven't yet told you that much about Geoffrey Bawa. He actually starts his career as a lawyer, having first read English literature at Cambridge. And he, in fact, comes from a family of lawyers. And it's only later in life that he decides to become an architect, and he qualifies after 2 years at the Architectural Association in London in 1957. He was then 38 years old. And when he returns to Sri Lanka at this point as an architect, the country has been independent from the British for 10 years. There's a ton of institutional building going on. It's a great time to be an architect. And one of the earliest projects he does is these two buildings for a school in Colombo. And that sliver that you see on the left is the ocean. So the school is located right on the edge of Colombo's coastline. And it was fantastic when it opened. Here you see it presented in the UK journal Concrete Quarterly of 1969. But despite the journal's claims that reinforced concrete would be economical and provide easy maintenance by the sea, this material turned out to be completely unsuited to Sri Lanka's climate, especially its location by the ocean with the close sea breeze coming in. The reinforcements corroded, the low-pitch roofs and their shallow eaves were unable to keep the monsoon out, although this made it incredibly popular among the students because class got cancelled whenever it rained too hard. And in this photograph, you see two of those young users, as well as Ulrich, who I mentioned earlier. And I think Bawa realized immediately that this way of building that he had been taught at the AA and that was happening around the world was not going to solve the problems of Sri Lanka. He embarks on a sequence of explorations of the roof, realizing its all-important function in the monsoon weather, as you can see from this quote. And now we'll look at a few of these roofs. So here you see another school. It's actually it's a building in the school that I attended, and these projecting balconies, which are open on either side, allowing the winds to come, and they're at a low height as well, which also brings a lot of cross-ventilation. They also support these pitches at every level so that it actually works perfectly. And below, you see Bawa's penultimate project, a house on a stunning oceanfront cliff, where he uses this single pitch roof with the bedrooms actually sunken below ground. So all you really see is the roof. It is an exercise in restraint, and explores how little building you might need if your site looks like this. And this project, which is the State Steel Corporation, is one where the concrete buttresses support the overhanging upper floor. And this way of using the story above to shelter the story below is actually traditional with timber architecture in Sri Lanka. But here you see Geoffrey experimenting with that system in concrete. And here, because the site is not by the ocean, and because there is enough shelter for the stories below, and there's also tons of, these are operable, those central squares are operable, so there is ventilation. And this building, although now not used, fared better. And here you see the Bentota Beach Hotel. It's one of the first and most popular resorts in the region, completed in 1969. The project was renovated in 2021, and what was amazing was at this point they realized that the balconies are actually hung from the roof above. And this is, using reinforcement in a very contemporary way. And this project had always been celebrated for how it sat in a coastal village and celebrated for its kind of harmony with the vernacular. And I think what it actually shows is that Geoffrey understood what we often talk about today with craft as an extension of technology, or technology as an extension of craft. And here is that hotel from the exterior. And that shadow you see in the lower left is Geoffrey's partner, Dr. Purgasundaram, who was this brilliant structural engineer and a really key player in realizing a lot of this work. And one of the things that actually becomes apparent through the archives is the vast multitude of collaborators that Bawa relied on, and his ability to bring them together and work with their strengths. And when you enter this hotel, the lobby has this Technicolor batik ceiling that Ena de Silva, whose house we looked at, her batik collective made. And Bawa had also this keen understanding of an architect's role in sustaining the arts. And throughout his career, he worked extensively with Ena's batik collective, with a handloom practice by Barbara Sansoni. Both of their work you can see upstairs. And these were social projects that were structured to provide employment and empowerment to women's collectives, and which still function. And I think throughout his career, he ensured that as an architect, they were given commissions, they were celebrated. And here's another view of that hotel. And I should also mention that in the 60s and then into the 70s, Sri Lanka has a closed economy, which means that imports were heavily restricted. And this is a result of the country participating in the non-aligned movement, that is, countries that are not siding with the Cold War nations, and they were mostly post-colonial nations that were striving towards self-sufficiency. which was, very, very challenging in many ways in the country. But it did drive invention in Bawa's practice, because he and his colleagues have studied, across the world. They're getting press from across the world, but they're unable to anything they want has to be made in Sri Lanka. And when they did a hotel like this, everything from the cutlery to the uniforms were designed and made in Sri Lanka out of necessity. And through the archives, I think it also becomes apparent that as much as Geoffrey works with the specificity of site, his work is also changing the landscape of building in Sri Lanka in a very impactful way. So I mentioned the bonfire when Geoffrey was moving offices. And what happened was that in 1983, when Sri Lanka had a series of very violent race riots, which led to the start of the Civil War, his partner, Dr. Palogasundaram, who was from the Tamil ethnic minority, wanted to migrate. And Geoffrey himself was of mixed Muslim, English, and Dutch-Berg ancestry. So at this point, Geoffrey buys Dr. Palogasundaram's share of the firm. He rents his office, which is what you see here, and everyone assumes that he has retired. But in fact, it is the beginning of a last and prolific phase in his career. In 1991, at the height of the country's 26-year-long civil war, he's approached by a Sri Lankan company, Aitken Spence Hotels, to make a hotel in the island's cultural triangle, which is, this blue triangle is by me, where he's essentially, it's where 4 ancient cities that date from the 5th century BC are located. The clients, they really were, I think, struggling to bring tourism into the country. It was one of the only sources of income. He had also already purchased a site, but Geoffrey persuaded him to buy a different site, which he found via helicopter. And one of the things we have no idea is, how did he know about this boulder? Because this hotel is essentially wrapping this huge boulder that was in the forest. And the minute that this project became known, it was met with an enormous public outcry from cultural preservationists, religious groups, as well as environmentalists. And this controversy is recorded in our archives, where unlike for any other project by the office, we have this huge dossier of press clippings, sometimes annotated to show people in the firm. I think one of these, you can see that there's an arrow pointing to the project architect who's in this photograph. And, it was just front page news for months and months. And I wouldn't want to be kind of naive about a project like this, and I think it's a very important question to say, what does it mean as an architect to build on a previously untouched site? The reason the project got government approval was because it generated a huge amount of jobs. And I just think through the archives, it's quite interesting to explore this question and how both the client and the architect responded. So during construction, you would have, busloads of pilgrims coming to protest at the site, and they would be welcomed and given a tour of the site so that it was kind of demystified, and then given a passion fruit juice. The concerns on the environmental side was partly because the site is where you have a reservoir that is, used for agricultural practice, and this is at the core of how the Sri Lankan village was, it's an agrarian economy for the most part. It was traditionally, and so these tanks were really key elements in paddy cultivation and also culturally. And so the idea of putting a hotel next to a tank was seen as sort of very disruptive, as well as the way the local wildlife would rely on the tank. And so both from a design perspective and an operation perspective, they bring in green screens, green roofs, recycling of water, local food cultivation, and all of these things are totally banal today. But 30 years ago in Sri Lanka, when there was not really this conversation around ecotourism, it was pioneering. And what was also amazing was that the company took the social impact of the project to heart and employed a lot of very local workforce. And today, a lot of the senior management at the hotel are people who started off at an entry level when the project was opened. And I think that Bawa did have an inkling that a project like this will have a ratcheting effect. And he paid granular attention to details. Like, he was very specific about trees not being removed from the site and building around every existing tree. He specified what kind of music could be played in the lobbies. None. But he did allow a flautist to be placed on the rocks at moonlight, and that flautist still plays. But of course, you can't regulate these things. So while the project was eventually accepted by both the public and the press, and it's now really celebrated, I think it did also then engender a series of other developments that maybe do play music in their lobbies. But maybe most amazing to me, and this is what the project looks like today, is the way that he envisioned its lifespan. And he said to one of his colleagues, this project will be complete when it has returned to ruin and the leopards and bears roam its corridors. Amazingly, during COVID, when there were no guests, there were elephants in the corridors of this hotel. He did something similar just prior to having his final stroke, where perhaps in a moment of clairvoyance, he told a colleague about his beloved garden, Lunuganga, if something happens to me, let it go back, let it grow back. Maybe you can maintain the very top level of the lawn. And I have here a quote, I don't know if you guys can see it at the back, which says, "Becoming is not a contradiction of being, but an epiphany of being." And it's by Ananda Kumaraswamy, who is a very, very popular, at the time of Geoffrey's practice, a metaphysicist and philosopher and art historian who writes a lot about the ways in which different world philosophies, bridging both East and West, define eternity as a moment in time or a mutation of time. And Geoffrey is also born in 1919, which is the year that Einstein's theory of relativity becomes mainstream. So this is speculation on my part, but I think fundamental to his being was this questioning of time. Because we'd often, it's not every architect that builds into their project its eventual ruin, I think. And that has really been at the core of us questioning what are our archives? How do we define them? How do we preserve them? One of the most incredible efforts of the Trust before I joined was in 2010, when Ena de Silva, whose house was the first project I showed you, she decided to sell the house. She was already not living in it. It was by then next to a hospital. And this caused a huge uproar from the local architecture community because, it was a really important house. It had demonstrated the value of a courtyard in an urban setting in Colombo. But there's no landmarks commission or really any state apparatus to save buildings like that in Sri Lanka. Our laws are still largely concerned with, buildings that are millennia old rather than centuries. And so the architecture community stepped in and urged the Trust to do something. And Ena said, I've sold the land, but I'm happy to give the house to the Trust. And so, within a period of a month, the entire house was numbered and documented and dismantled by a very small team of architects and archaeologists. And at one point, they were demolishing one end of the house while still measuring and documenting the other side of the house. For 9 years, it was in storage, the original storage in its elements. And the original intention was that it be rebuilt within the campus of the Sri Lankan, the main architecture university. But a site could not be secured, and eventually the Trust rebuilt it adjacent to Bawa's garden in Lunuganga, which is sort of 80 kilometers south of Colombo. And here you see it in its new home. But given that this house was paradigmatically an urban dwelling to now have it in this kind of rural, bucolic setting, some scholars have suggested that this is in fact an archived version of itself. And today, every river stone and every piece of timber carries the number that brought it from Colombo into its correct place relationally in Bentata. And when we think about an archive, maybe using the International Council of Archives definition, which is repositories that are authentic, reliable, usable, and which have integrity. I think the materials that I've shown you meet those definitions, but I also feel they somehow don't feel sufficient to describe Bawa's practice. And when we think about what he really cared about, there's no doubt that it is his garden, Lunuganga. When he wrote a deed in 1982, 20 years before he passed, basically establishing the Geoffrey Bawa Trust, and it would inherit his estate when he passed. It was a non-profit that would be in the service of art, architecture, and ecology. And he's very particular about what could and could not happen to Lunuganga. It's a very generous view, but it's very prescriptive. And there's not even a mention of the drawings or even his own legacy. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about Lunuganga. When Geoffrey returns to Sri Lanka the first time, having qualified as a lawyer in 1948, he purchases an abandoned cinnamon and rubber estate and creates this garden. A plantation estate is an inherently extractive engagement with the land. Colonizers are often most interested in financial value. They don't really care about monocultures. And so for Bawa to turn this back into a garden is actually quite engaged, and we might today see it as a decolonial act. And increasingly, as we studied with botanists and environmentalists, we realized that all the flora that was so carefully placed performs a really important aesthetic function, but it is also an incredibly diverse repository of indigenous and endemic species. And rather than relying on kind of uninterrupted axes, Geoffrey constructs space through the interplay of forms. So here you see the cinnamon hill in the garden, and he uses that Mingja in the middle that you can see to slow the gaze, taking in space as an unfolding continuum rather than a single vanishing point. I think the Ulipo writer George Perec best describes this when he says, "Our gaze travels through space and gives us the illusion of relief and distance. This is how we construct space, with an up and down, a left and right, an in front and a behind, a near and a far." And here you see the map which Bimal has already shown you, locating Sri Lanka, which Bawa uses in his first monograph, the first monograph that was on his work. He didn't write it, but he was involved in the production of it, and many of the drawings upstairs were actually made for that book, and was published in 1986. By positioning Colombo at the center, Bawa is making the point that when it comes to perspective, what we see at the center depends on where we're looking from. We might recall the Bellman's map in Lewis Carroll's The Hunting of the Snark, and I think Bawa's refusal to peg himself to convention is an often overlooked but brilliant aspect of his personality and practice. Bawa's name for the garden, Lunuganga, is a lexical blend. In one of our native tongues, Sinhala, Lunu means salt and Ganga means river, and it alludes to the brackish water surrounding the peninsula on which the garden sits. Salt and water dissolved and amalgamated. This is a place where things intertwine, art and architecture, buildings and garden, inside and outside. And in this practice, you see the work of someone who consistently works in spheres of multiplicity and hybridity. We can see the garden as forming a spine to his architectural corpus. It is so intertwined with his practice, and he works on it for almost 5 decades. From before he's even an architect, it's actually when he makes this garden that he has a cousin who says, you clearly have a deftness with this, and if you go and become an architect, you can do this with other people's money. And that's when he gives up law and switches to architecture. And he works on it right until his death, even after he had suffered a severe stroke that left him largely immobile and non-vocal. He used very subtle gestures of fingers to indicate which brows should be pruned and to keep the garden going. We know that Lunuganga was a testing ground, a laboratory, a studio for him. Many have speculated that the hen house that you see here is actually a maquette, modeling proportion, a double cantilevered roof, and a frame and infill pattern that is then translated into the various pavilions of the new Sri Lankan Parliament, which Geoffrey would complete in 1982. In 1983, which is a year I've spoken about quite a bit, right after the Parliament is completed, and as I mentioned, a year where there was a horrific racial riot, Bawa builds the sandala, or the garden room, which you see on the left here. And it is one of the most tranquil and meditative spaces in Lunuganga. It's the only structure that is really for working and not for inhabiting or, sleeping. And sure, he has just been paid for building the nation's parliament, so of course he would treat himself to a building in his garden. But you see this kind of very deep interplay between his life, the country's history, and what manifests at Lunuganga. Perhaps the most iconic element in the garden is this giant frangipani or Plumeria obscura tree at the corner of the front lawn. Crafted by Bawa over the course of making the garden, like a giant bonsai, he would weigh down the boughs to create this form. It is both sculpture and tree. It creates a corner and frames views, but it is also part of an ecosystem, a host of numerous species of lichen, and a perch for generations of resident bulbuls. Here you see an early photograph of the tree, about 75 years ago, and you see that it starts off as a spatial marker. It's marking the corner. And when we look at photographs of the garden over time, the frangipani is an evolving constant, indicating the passage of time by its size and shape. It is such a vital part of the garden, of the collection, but being alive, it reminds us of the fragile and changing nature of museum collections. Here I have Carlo Rovelli's quote about the nature of matter, and he says, "We can think of the world as made up of things, of substances, of entities, of something that is, or we can think of it as made up of events, of happenings, of processes, of something that occurs, something that does not last and that undergoes continual transformation, that is not permanent in time." And a garden is, of course, ever-changing, but thinking about it as part of our archives has been really fundamental to how we think about change. And it's not to say that we don't believe in preservation or conservation, but we are also aware that we are working with the laws of entropy. When Bawa's friend Ray Wijewardhan, an amateur pilot, decides to visit by air and then needs to make a crash landing, he decided to do so on the roof of the main house, knowing that Geoffrey, I quote, would never forgive him if he damaged a tree. The only book that Geoffrey works on directly, or himself, is a volume of black and white photographs and drawings titled Lunuganga, which is, of course, about the garden. And knowing how intentional he was about leaving anything in writing and also about creating this garden, we can almost read it as a biography. And one area in which this has been incredibly helpful is actually in understanding Bawa himself. Last year, my colleague Thelini Pereira, who is in the audience here, launched an installation called The Order of Nature, which explores the garden from a queer lens. The title is from the language used in the Sri Lankan Penal Code, which was, of course, established by the British colonizers to discriminate LGBTQIA individuals, and unfortunately still in effect. And the garden allows us to examine themes like otherness and subversion through its makeup, while respecting Bawa's fierce privacy about his own identity. And above all, I believe what is so compelling about the life and work of Geoffrey Bawa is the way his career navigated the world on its own terms, not relying on historical movements, theories, or labels in which to see itself or to be seen, but simply, essentially, to be there. Thank you.
So we have time for questions, and Shayari was generous to leave time for you to interact with her. So you can have the mic. We have anxious questions. Let's wait for your mic. Thank you. Who wants to go first?
First of all, congratulations and thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation, and it's lovely to be able to find a continuity from the tour in the morning to the lecture now. I have a question about the role of text and memory, because I think it is really apparent in the projects that you've selected and in the composition of this lecture that Geoffrey Bawa was very much preoccupied with a certain poetic of being. There's a certain meticulousness, a conscientiousness as to how things unfold over time. And it's also equally fascinating how you mentioned, when he moved office, he burnt parts of the archive or the archival materials. And I'm really curious then, in the kind of spatial and material expression of his works, is the ruin the ultimate destination for everything that Bawa wants to do? And in the context of that possibility, what then is the role of the Bawa Trust? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question. One of the most amazing anecdotes I heard was about in our oral history, somebody who met Bawa for the first time in his garden, and he's like instructing somebody to put a pile of bricks together, and he says, well, I'm just making a ruin. And then this thing kept getting broken and made and broken and made. So I don't know that he saw the ruin as a kind of static thing either. And I don't, being a person, it's all kind of complex. If you look at drawings like this, which Geoffrey did not do, but then signs, right? Because it's shown in the exhibition at Reba in '88. I mean, if he really didn't care, why would he sign this? So I think it's more complex. It's not to say that he did not think about, how things will survive. I think he partly understood that in the climate of Sri Lanka, which it's the perfect recipe for decay. And so I think he kind of accepted that. But it's not to say that every building was intended to not be. It's just that is a fact, right? Every building will eventually not be. But it wasn't that he was building everything to crumble in a short amount of time. But the Bawa Trust, our mandate it's very beautifully written by Geoffrey, and it really is about fostering, and he knew, he was a great collector. He knew that he was, in his estate, there would be material that he had enjoyed privately his whole life, but he knew that it would have value beyond himself. And I think what's quite amazing is how you see this intensely private person. I mean, Lunuganga, one of the reasons I think Bawa is gaining traction more globally now is that for the longest time, you couldn't visit any of it, Lunuganga or his house. But he specifies that work that is done in the service of these three disciplines, art, architecture, and ecology, is what our real mandate is. And of course, using the collection is part of that work. Preserving it is part of that work. But I think understanding that we are preserving the work of somebody who understood that nothing would last is also part of that.
Yeah, I was just wondering, given that Geoffrey Bawa, embraced kind of like letting some of his buildings be taken back by nature, and this kind of change that, even though it was all about control, allowed that into, like, how has his concept of time really influenced the archives methods and how you view, how to properly treat Bawa's collection?
Yeah. When it comes to the collection, which is the kind of the fine arts objects, the drawings, we are not taking Bawa's approach because, it would be a bonfire by now. We are, the Trust is the only institution in Sri Lanka that is a part of CMAM. We endeavor to uphold global standards because this work is heritage, right? It is larger than itself in some ways. And so we are not trying to destroy it or anything. It is only in understanding it in relationship to something like the garden. And the garden itself is this, which I hope you'll all do at some point, when you visit it, it's such a clear negotiation between the man-made line and the line of nature. And it's like the entire thing is this kind of back and forth between moments when nature takes over and moments where like paving will take over. And it is in trying to preserve something that is living. And it's really in like thinking about what happens to the frangipani tree that's now 75 years old. And frangipani trees are not long-living trees. What do we do then? So I think it's with questions like that we start thinking about change and impermanence. But I think, it's really like the work of Sisyphus to be an archivist in Sri Lanka. Like, it's not possible, but you still do it.
Question. Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. I had a question regarding Bawa's practice. I read somewhere that he joined initially a firm, Edward Briggs and Bake. When he started, did he ever start his own practice, or did he want to practice over time? And if yes, what happened to the practice after he died?
Thanks. That's it's kind of an unanswered question, because when he joins the practice in 1958, he joins as a partner, which is also kind of wild. Right. Just like start off right at the top. And it's a colonial practice called Edwards Reed and Begg that has done many, many important buildings in Colombo. And he also has a partner at the time called Valentine Gunasekar, who has worked with Saarinen and does these incredible kind of concrete forms. So there is this, in the first 5 years, there are these two. They could not be more different to these two individuals, but they're working in the same space. And eventually Valentine takes off on his own practice. And even the parliament drawings still bear the name Edwards Reed and Begg. And right up until that moment where he moves offices from the space that I showed you to his house, the official name is Edwards Reed and Begg. And we have many theories and no answers as to why that was the case. And it was only when he and when he bought out his partner that then he works as Geoffrey Bawa and Associates. But it's kind of amazing because it means that all of this work has the names of 3 people that were no longer living. But I don't know why.
Kyle.
Thank you. Thanks for the great talk. When you look at his architecture, it feels as if there are moments that are influenced by vernacular detail, and then there are other moments that feel like full classical, and then there are other moments that feel like high modernism. Mm-hmm. Did you see a conflict between those vocabularies?
No, I think that there's a quote upstairs where he talks about the past, and he talks about he talks about the layers of, as Bimal mentioned in the introduction, Sri Lanka was colonized for 500 years. And essentially, that was colonized by the West, but really as an island that was right in the middle of all of the trade routes, its entire history is people from the East and the West and the North and the South coming into it. So Geoffrey, given that he himself is of mixed, he has Muslim heritage, which is from Sri Lanka, he has Dutch burgher, he has British, I think that was kind of fundamental to his understanding of the place, was that it was layered. And what was amazing about him was the way he didn't feel these things they felt they could coexist, and he was totally happy for this sort of hybridity. And the Palladio that arrives in Sri Lanka is actually now Sri Lankan as well, because it's pervasive, and he was happy to take that in. I think that's one of the things that's quite striking about him, because a lot of his contemporaries were completely rejecting colonial ways of building, but Geoffrey understood that there was lots to pull from all the elements of the past, and we make the present by how we layer that. And as you say, he talks about looking at the past for solutions, but not the whole solution.
We have time for one more question. Thank you, Shayari.